Okay, welcome to today's lesson. We are here in the Hollywood Hills at a really cool house that is actually on the market right now, currently being used as a rental. So what you can see behind me is pretty much the entirety of the downstairs. The upstairs is a similar size. It's not that big of a house and we don't really need to scout it. It just took me a 30-second look to get a good handle on this place. So on all four sides of this house, we have mountains or trees or retaining walls, because again, we're in the Hollywood Hills and we're kind of built in to a hillside here. The great thing is we've got white walls everywhere. The not so great thing is these countertops and this island is almost solid black marble, and it's going to be pretty difficult to photograph that black and white contrast. For this first shot, I'm going to photograph the kitchen, which is going to be particularly difficult because of all the high contrast reflective surfaces I just mentioned, and you can see behind me. Now this downstairs is one big space and we could probably capture it in 4 to 5 photos total, but we're just going to be focusing on a few big shots that present certain challenges here. So let me grab my camera and I'll show you why photographing this is going to be a little bit trickier than usual. So a lot of people are fans of one-point perspectives in kitchens, and here's an obvious one. I have a 17mm lens on and I'll just get a quick test shot. So this is actually going to be a really tricky photo for a number of reasons. We've got these windows behind the sink, and as you can see, that reflection on the countertop is just really difficult to deal with. When it meets the range, it's super confusing, and that range hood is coming down and intersecting with the windows behind the sink. So while the one-point perspective is a pretty easy go-to shot in most cases, here I think it's going to be a little trickier than normal. I would definitely not do this angle if I could help it. In addition, we miss the real size of the space. We don't get a sense of the living room or the dining room. This shot is so dark, and it's an otherwise pretty bright space, but what's happening is this brown and black kitchen is just sucking up all the light and making it really difficult to tell what's going on. So let's try another angle. All right, so we've taken a few steps to the right, and I'm looking at a sort of a classic two-point composition here. You've got the dining room in the background, and we've got the kitchen in the foreground. So I've got, again, my 17mm lens. I'll take a few test shots. And immediately I see a few big problems here. With the 17mm lens, this is just way too wide. Everything looks a bit distorted, and because I'm so close to the countertop, that thing is being stretched out way, way, way too much. If you take a look at these reflections, you can see the chandelier and dining space being reflected in the kitchen counter island top. It just adds a ton of confusion. And then down on the left, you've got all these bar stools running into the dining table in the back. There's a lot going on. If you can see out the door back there, we see a lot of HVAC and pool equipment. So I don't necessarily think this is the best way to showcase the space. So I'm going to take a few steps to my left and try a one-point perspective looking this way. So I like this a bit better, but I'm still not totally sold on it. I love all the leading lines, but the reflections are still kind of killing me. And if you see to my left, there's this beautiful living room and pool, and I think we'd be making a mistake to not capture that. So let's try the other end and look back and try to get a sense of this entire long space. Okay, so we have now come down the other end, and I still got my 17mm lens on, and I'm going to try a shot looking right down this walkway so we can see the living room, pool, and the beautiful plants out there as well. So again, I've got the 17mm lens on, and it's great for scouting, but this is just comically wide for shooting, so I would not recommend that you shoot with this thing. But to give you an idea, here we go. Now, this to me feels like Stanley Kubrick just walked in here and started filming A Space Odyssey. It is super wide. The lights give it kind of like a cool pathway to follow, but it doesn't really show the kitchen that well, and it makes it feel like we're in this bowling alley that's just massive, right? I don't really like it. I can take a few steps to my left and line up with the counter, and I don't think this looks too bad, but again, we're still really wide, and I feel like this huge piece of our island is just too visually dense to be the starting point of our photograph. It's just going to stop you from going in any further. In addition, you can see where this island runs into all of the furniture. There's a lot of black and white furniture down there. Again, you can't really tell where the island ends and the living room begins. It's just a little bit too visually confusing for me. I'm going to take a couple steps to my left and do another test shot with my 17. And I think we're getting a little bit closer to what I like. The reason I like to be over here is because I get to see some of these appliances that are buried in the island. These are really nice high-end appliances, and if I'm here, I get a sense of the size of the island, but again, very visually dense, hard to see through, confusing at the end. One more step to the left, I get a view of not only the island, but the appliances contained within it. I get a nice shot of all this cabinetry, and I have a great leading line that takes me down to the living room that is not so visually confusing, and I can still see the pool, the green wall of plants down there, those great windows, and there's great light. We've got the brightest part of the frame being all the way at the end, which is going to pull our eye through, and we're not going to be blocked and tripped up by stuff in the foreground. So I think I'm going to be in here somewhere. Because this is way too wide, I'm going to grab a 24mm lens, see if I can tighten it up and get a better composition. Okay, so we've got our camera mounted on our tripod and our 24mm lens ready to go. What I'm going to do is try to find the best composition, and I'll walk you through my process. So I'm going to grab my tripod, and I don't know exactly where I want to be, but I'm going to take a few test shots and kind of narrow this down here. I'm going to start a little higher. Okay, here's our first shot, and the 24mm immediately tightens things up. We do lose some cabinet, we lose some island, we lose some of that theater on the right, but it significantly simplifies the shot, and we don't really lose anything that I would consider too important. We know the color of the cabinetry, we probably can infer that there's more. We get a feel for the size of the island, but we don't need to see the whole darn thing, which is going to block our view. But there's a few problems here, like the chandelier, the pendant light down at the end is hidden halfway behind the range hood. Again, that island could be better resolved, and there's I kind of feel like I'm in a weird spot here. There's a corner of the island missing on the right-hand side, and I either want to have less of it or show the whole thing. So I'm going to kind of see if I can get in a little bit better of a spot here. Maybe if I put these lights right in the center of the frame, that'll be worth trying. And I like how this feels, but I don't like how I'm losing the pendant light and I'm cutting through half of the other one. So maybe it's more like right here. That's not bad either. Something that bugs me is I'm seeing into the bottom of the range hood, which is kind of a little bit confusing, but I'm afraid if I go any higher, I'm going to feel like I'm looking down into the frame. All right, so I'm going to get level with the bottom of the range hood. Yeah, this is feeling pretty good to me. The one thing I want to do is separate that pendant from the range hood, and I wonder, do I back up a little bit to get that? Let's see. Yeah, okay, I'm liking this. Let's try this. Now the pendant is separate from the range hood. So I think I'm in a great spot here. What I have is I've got the island, and I've got this really nice sort of slash of white, looks like quartz going through it, which is kind of cool to see. I've got my two pendants separated from the range hood. I don't see the bottom of the range hood. The range hood doesn't overlap with the TV, the built-ins over there on the right where the TV and fireplace are, so that's visually separated. The viewer can get a good idea of what's going on. The pendant is separated from the range hood. I see a little bit of the screening room, which I don't really mind. And what I like is the island. I'm going to have to move some furniture down at the end to separate some things, but it's clear where the island begins and ends. Now, there are some reflections on the island that I'm going to want to deal with so I can see the sort of veins in that marble a little bit better. Other than that, I think I'm in a pretty good spot. One thing that's bugging me is on the left-hand side of the frame, it looks like things are a little bit stretched because they're so close to the camera, but I don't think that that is important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I use a tilt-shift lens to compose without actually moving the camera. I'd like to get more of the screening room and less of these cabinet uppers on the left-hand side. Rather than shifting up and down, I'm going to shift left and right. There's right, there's left. Now obviously left is a little bit goofy, but if I shift to the right, I can get just enough of that screening room. I can also shift diagonally down, which might be the right call here because I can pick up more of that island and more of the screening room at the same time. Again, I can go diagonal. I'm not moving the camera at all. The perspective is staying exactly the same. I'm only changing the field of view. If I didn't have a tilt-shift lens, I would have to actually pan the camera, and you can see that our horizontal lines are immediately falling away from level. And this is where you get into trouble. The whole room kind of feels like it wasn't built correctly or it's slanting. And you can imagine if you put a marble on that countertop, when I pan to the right, it looks like it's going to fall off. So by lining up all my horizontal and vertical lines and then shifting to find the correct composition, everything still remains relatively level and vertical, horizontal and vertical. So a very, very useful lens for this type of photography. Okay, so here is our final composition. Let's get to work making this look as good as we possibly can. Now that I've got my composition set, I want to make sure I have the perfect focus. So what I usually do is I tend to focus a third or halfway into the room. In this case, I'll focus on the range here. Because I'm using such a wide lens, 24 millimeters, I can go to f11 and that'll pretty much guarantee that everything will be in focus front to back. All right, so I've got the camera focused, my composition set, and my settings dialed in. My base exposure here is 1/8 of a second, f11, ISO 200. So before I finish this shot and add lighting and remove the reflections, what I have to do is make sure all the styling is perfect. So we're going to take a look at our current setup here. And some of the chairs down there are looking a little bit goofy. They don't really make sense. They're facing outward rather than inward. We can probably simplify by removing some magazines and some of the plants and whatnot, and generally clean this up a little bit better and make sure that everything is in its perfect position. Because the kitchen is basically empty, there's nothing to really touch there. We got lucky. We're not going to have to deal with any styling in the foreground. So let's go take a look down here at what we need to fix. I've always been really proud of my attention to detail, and I think it's super important to take the extra 2 to 3 minutes, especially when you're shooting some of these staged homes, to clean them up a little bit and declutter them. So in this case, we've got a few things that I think add some visual clutter. We've got these magazines that aren't really necessary because they're so far from the camera, you can't tell what they are. They just kind of get in the way and add one more thing we don't need to see. This plant might be a little bit too much with all these reflections going on. Anything we can take out to simplify is going to go a long way to cleaning up this shot and helping the viewer understand what they're really looking at. So Colleen, can I see what we're looking at here with the iPad? Great. So I am now screen recording on my iPad so you can see how I style. If I zoom in here, see this plant and this plant? They're about 7 feet apart, but because again, they're so far, they look like they're on top of each other and just very visually dense. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take out this entire table, including everything on it. And we're going to take out these magazines as well. And next what I want to do is make sure that these chairs are actually facing in a direction that makes a bit of sense. So we can tuck them in a little bit. And as you can see, we didn't really lose anything by taking that table out, but we hugely simplified the area and made it clear that it's a nice living room kind of sitting area while reducing the visual clutter. What we're going to do with these pillows here is do a quick fluff. We're going to make them look nice and plump and make sure they look like they were intentionally placed there rather than just casually thrown. So that was a relatively quick fix, and it made the photo look, in my opinion, much, much better. A lot less going on, a lot easier to understand the flow of the home. Now that these quick styling fixes are all set, let's get back to the camera and start lighting this thing. So we're back at the camera position, and there's a few problems that I want to solve, and there's a couple solutions that we have to tackle them. First of all, the interior, the practical light, or the lighting that we see in the photograph that is not our own, I personally find it a little bit distracting, and I'm not a big fan of can lights in the ceiling. They tend to flatten out the light, and they're not very pretty to look at. As you can see here, in the top of the marble countertop, you can see the reflections of all those can lights. So I'm going to turn those off. And take a shot. And immediately our countertop is much cleaner. I may even go so far as to Photoshop those little reflections out when I get to post. I'm not quite sure yet. We also don't have those screaming hot cans right in the top corner of our photograph. Those things immediately grab your eye and distract. So by turning those off, we've taken one more step to cleaning up this shot. Now, I'm very much of the opinion if you're shooting in broad daylight, you don't need to have every light in the house on. Does anyone live like that? If you're home during the day, are you going to turn on every light for every waking moment? I don't think so. I personally don't. But what we do have are these tungsten Edison bulbs in these pendants, and I do think it's pretty cool. So because that's something a little bit more interesting than a can, I want to leave those on to show that those actually have a bit of color, a bit of style to them, rather than these daylit balanced can lights, which I find very boring and borderline offensive in their color. So there's two remaining issues that I see that I'm ready to fix. Number one, a common situation that you might find yourself in is to have these dark cabinets, and as you can see, they are picking up the reflection of that green shrubbery outside. Now, there's a couple ways to tackle this, and I'm going to show you two today. Those two solutions are either adding light, which might seem counterintuitive, but by increasing our shutter speed to kill the reflections of the exterior, and then adding light, you can generally get a much better color. The other one is to use a circular polarizer. That's a bit trickier. It may not work depending on which direction the reflections are coming from and how wide your lens is. So between those two ways to do this, let's try both and see what looks better. So I've added the polarizer, and they usually cut about 2 stops of light, so I've adjusted my shutter speed to compensate. I'm now at half a second, f11, ISO 200. Here I am spinning the polarizer, and you can see how the reflections in the frame change very significantly. Look at those cabinets. They go from almost pure white to a nice brown. So the results are pretty good, but they're not as good as they possibly can be, and they may work for you, but what I want to show you is how to use flash to reduce those reflections even further. So I'm going to take the polarizer off and shoot this with the lens naked, but I'm going to introduce a flash and increase the shutter speed to cut down the amount of ambient light coming in and light those cabinets predominantly with a flash. Alright, so I've got my flash mounted up, and in my hand, again, this is just a Profoto B10, perfect hand-holdable size for one person. What I'm going to do to reduce that reflection using flash instead of a polarizer is I'm going to increase my shutter speed, which is going to knock down the amount of ambient coming into the frame. I'm then going to use the flash to add light back into the frame, but rather than have that light come from the window angle, which is showing up as a reflection, I'm going to bounce it off the ceiling from the right-hand side of the frame. That way, the cabinets are not going to reflect that light back into the camera. It's very important to make sure that once you start doing this, your camera does not move. So make sure anyone else on set is aware of that and doesn't do anything crazy like accidentally kick it. Okay, so I've moved down a little bit, and I'm picking a spot where the flash can bounce off the ceiling and not be obstructed by this range hood. My settings are now 1/15 of a second, f11, ISO 400. And like I said, I increased my shutter speed, made it a little bit faster to remove some of that ambient light coming in from outside, which is going to kill that reflection. I'm now going to bounce this light off the ceiling, and that is going to add light back onto the cabinetry, but it's going to be coming from a different direction, which is not going to show up as a reflection. So again, we're cutting out the ambient, replacing it with flash, and getting rid of the reflection. I'm then going to cut that out in post-production and blend it in over the sort of out-of-control natural reflections that we're getting from the outside. One cool bonus that we're getting here is that the painting behind me is now perfectly clear and free of reflections. As you can see in the original ambient shots, there's all these reflections of the windows out here, which again adds one more bit of visual confusion to this entire photo. So we've had a nice little happy accident there. One more place that I want to add light is in this theater, which is completely blacked out. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bounce a flash off the ceiling and add a little bit of light in here, because no matter how long my shutter speed is, I feel like that light is going to be way too dim and kind of ugly, right? So I'm going to just add a little bit of flash and work some of that sexy light back in. Now I'm going to bounce a light to take care of the reflections in the countertop. I'm going to move a little bit further down, because if I'm back here, the light pretty much bounces over everything and misses this. But by bouncing a light here, I ensure that there's a nice soft light hitting the entire top of this reflective surface, and it's going to improve the way it looks significantly. Again, we are taking control of those reflections by increasing our shutter speed to let less ambient light in, and then introducing flash from a different direction to remove the reflection. So here we go. I am at 1/15 of a second, f11. And as you can see, that countertop looks a lot better than when it was lit with only ambient light. I've got nice, clear veins of quartz running through here. You get a good sense of the color, and there's nothing that's really super distracting. There's a little bit of reflection in there, so it still feels natural, but it's not totally out of control like it was before. Now, moving further back in the room, you can see there's a lot more ambient light coming in from two directions. I feel like that is lit pretty darn well. It's a little bit blown out, but I don't mind it. I want to keep it bright back there. Those black window frames, because there's so much light inside, they're not really blooming or anything else. They look pretty freaking good to me. I don't need to light down there. I think it's got a great natural feel, and I can let it be. So we composed our shot, we styled, we lit the interior, and reduced reflections using two different methods. All that's left is to run a bracket of exposures to ensure that we catch the exterior and any natural light in the interior that we might think is worth blending back in later to sort of even out some of that flash. So let's go ahead and do that now. If I scroll back on the Cam Ranger, I can find that my base exposure was 1/8 f11 ISO 200. So I'll go back to those settings. And I'm going to run a bracket of 5 shots, 2 stops up and 2 stops down. Now we've got all the pieces of this shot on location. Let's jump into post-production and put it together. So here we are in our first kitchen shot, and this is a little bit of a complicated one. We're gonna get right into it. As you saw on location, I did a bunch of flash exposures where I was bouncing that light into the ceiling off various parts in the room. And here in Lightroom, you can really see, or I can really see, how that is affecting different things. So this frame here gives me a great capture of the cabinetry on the left-hand side. As you can see, the reflections are tamed very well. There's much less of a color cast on them than there was in the pure ambient exposure. And in this shot here, you can see, look how clean the top of that counter is. That big giant island is looking pristine. The only real things I see on there that need any kind of work are some of these warped little ceiling cans. I think that's just sort of a result of the imperfect surface of the stone. It looks great otherwise. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to just grab certain parts of this image that have had flash added to them, that use ambient light, and we're going to start getting a little bit complicated here in Photoshop. So the first thing I'm going to want to do here are find my ambient exposures in my little Lightroom film strip here, and I'm going to put those in this edit folder. I'm going to line those up next to the flash exposures that I want to use, and these are the ones, like I said, that give me the best cabinetry, that remove that color cast, and do the same thing on the countertop. I'm trying to control those reflections as best and as quickly as I can. So here I have my 5 bracketed exposures and my 2 flash exposures, and I'm probably going to throw out the brightest. This is kind of useless to me. Even if I pull those shadows and highlights way down, I'm not going to want anything that bright. And the darkest one here, I'm probably going to be okay with just these middle 3 exposures. The dynamic range was wide, but not obscenely so. And I'm going to take these 2 flash exposures into Lightroom as well. But before I do that, I'm going to see if I can pull as much raw data as I can out of these files. And what I'll do is bring my highlights down and my shadows up. And as you can see, it's just chilling out some of the blacks and some of the whites out the windows and in the furniture. I'm going to take that same adjustment and I'm going to apply it to all of the frames that I'll be working with. Once I have applied those same adjustments to every image, I'm going to go ahead and right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and just to help me keep everything organized, I'm going to rename these guys by double clicking on them. I don't want to work with a string of numbers as long as pi itself. I just want simplicity, so I'm going to call this one Flash for Cabinets, and this one is Flash for Countertop. This one is going to be Ambient. We'll just call that Dark, Middle, Bright. And I'm going to start combining these to make our final image. So what I like about this bright exposure is the foreground. The foreground looks great. Kitchen looks pretty good. I like that there's a little bit of detail in this room over to the right. We forgot to move the clicker. That's annoying. I'll take that out in a bit. And in the middle exposure, I think this sitting area looks great. And in the dark exposure, I think the outdoors looks great. So I need to somehow take these pieces of each image. And what you might be saying is, well, you could just use a mask and use a brush. So let's try that. I'm going to alt-click here on the Add Layer Mask button. I'm going to take my brush, hit the B key, make my foreground color set to white, and start painting in. And as you can see, I mean, like, yes, that does an okay job. But look at the difference in brightness between, here, and maybe I could paint that out a little bit, you say. All right, but am I going to paint all this out? Maybe I could spend a lot of time getting in there with a smaller, more detailed brush. Okay. But as you can see, this is not really going to work on every image, especially if we go into this dark area here, and I've got to brush out each individual window pane. There's a lot of smooth transition that we're going to lose just by using the brush. And you can see that brush is leaking all over the TV, the black stone on the wall there, leaking onto the foreground of this island, and it just kind of looks really muddy. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a mask that more or less exactly follows the brightness of the room. When I use my brush to draw my mask in using black or white, that's great, but it's not very accurate. What I can do is then take the literal brightness and darkness of the room, I'll just show you what that looks like here, and make a mask based on the bright and dark tones of a black and white layer. Now I'm not going to use that black and white adjustment layer. I'm going to go into the channels palette. So I'm going to turn that middle layer on, and I want to grab the brightness out of this middle ambient shot. So I'll go to the channels palette, and on this RGB layer right here, you can command click, and that will activate a selection based on the brightness and shadow of the image. Photoshop is basically looking at the brights, the blacks and the whites, the brights and the darks, and making a selection based on how bright or how dark each part of the image is. So if I click this Save Selection as Channel button, and I click on this new Alpha 1 channel, Photoshop has made us a mask where it's black, it's going to be hidden, where it's white, it's going to be revealed. So basically, Photoshop is giving us this bright middle area in the windows, and that's what's going to be revealed. But I can take this one step further. I can hit Command M, that's the shortcut for curves, and I can then brighten or darken this mask so that my mask ignores all of the foreground and only reveals that middle ground. So that's extreme, obviously. I want to make a nice smooth transition from foreground to background, a nice smooth transition from my brightest exposure to my middle exposure, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to click OK. This is going to be the mask from which I make my next move. I'm going to command click on that, turn the RGB layers back on, go back to this middle exposure, make sure that's selected, with my selection highlighted here, the little black and white lines everywhere, click this Add Layer Mask button. It's going to apply that mask we just made to this middle layer. And you can see, if I hit backslash, all of this red is where the mask is hidden and the white is where it's revealed. So just by turning that on and off, I have recovered a ton of detail in the sort of blown out areas in the middle and back of the frame. Like look at this blanket for instance, right? Tons of detail is back in there. I don't have to waste time going in with a lasso or the pen tool or a brush, God forbid, and trying to make a mask manually. I can just click on those channels layers and make a mask exactly where I need it. Now, it is a little bit dull. We're going to get there. The next thing I want to do is do the same thing for the dark channel. So I'll turn the dark layer on, go back to channels, command or control click on that RGB layer, click on the Save Selection as Channel button, Command D to deselect that, click on my Alpha 2 channel, Command M, curves, brighten up the rear part of the image, and there, my mask is going to reveal the white, which is going to be the darkest layer, and hide the black. So click OK, Command click to activate that mask, turn RGB back on, go back on our dark layer, go ahead and click the Add Layer Mask button. And so what we have is a very flat image, right? I might not use all of this, but there's great things about each layer. So now that I have these three things, I'm going to go in and I'm going to turn these on and off, and I'm going to see what do I like, what do I dislike. There's some brightness here that gets taken away in the whites on the right hand side. So I'm just going to grab a brush. And again, I'm just going to shape very gently at 50% opacity. Paint out where I think the mask has gone a little bit too far. But I'm keeping that seamless transition, keeping the brights bright, the darks darks, the darks dark. But when I turn that on and off, you can see how much more natural it looks. And I'll do the same thing for the dark layer. Take my brush. I don't think we need any of that. Any of that outside of the furthest reaches of this image. Let's see. I even feel like we could get away with tossing this. I like what it does to the pool. I think everywhere else is a bit overkill with the darkness. So you know what I can do? I can like lower the opacity of this dark layer to keep it bright outside, but just bring that pool in a little bit. So I just change the opacity to 50% of the dark layer. And do the same thing with the middle, go to like 80. Again, I'm just sort of feathering, pushing, pulling. All right, I'll make a group. Select both layers, Command G. I'm gonna call this what this is known as, and that would be luminosity masking. You can turn that on and off and see what a difference it made with no flash or anything. Looks good, right? Next up, we've got to pull in the countertop and the cabinets. So this is simpler. Gonna use the lasso to do this. Don't need to go nuts, right? And if I use the brush, like you're gonna get my goofy shoes in that sort of feathered edge of the brush. So I'm just gonna use the lasso. I'll zoom in. Lasso the countertop, the polygonal lasso. That is the source of much debate here at the F-Stopper studio. Go around. I'll get the front of the island as well. And there it is. I'm going to click Add Layer Mask. And there we have a perfect, look at the difference, whew, in that countertop. Way better, way more mellow, right? The one thing I don't love is there's a bit of green reflecting from the windows back here. That's fine. We can add a adjustment layer, hue and saturation. I'm gonna clip it to that countertop layer. Again, grab the hand with the arrows, click, desaturate the yellows and the greens. Might not want to go super far with the yellows. Take so much of that warmth out. But there we go. You can see that greens have been significantly removed from that countertop. So same story with the cabinets. Turn that on. This is a bit of a more complicated shape, so I'm going to use the pen tool. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to use the pen tool. Because there's so much flash down here and up here, I'm just gonna lasso down. The only edge I'm really worried about is this edge. I don't want my flash to bleed beyond the edge of that cabinet. I want to keep it natural in the background. And I'm gonna come down here. I'm gonna add a layer mask. And I'm going to just brush that transition seamlessly into the ceiling. So I'm just going to use the white and black colors to sort of keep that natural ceiling, but the flashed cabinets. Again, I can just brush a gentle transition between flash and natural. And so it looks natural because the transition is smooth, right? Look at the mask. You know, it's got that brushed edge. But if you turn it on and off, look how much cleaner it is. And I can see the problems with this. You got natural light sort of underneath the uppers here. So I'm going to brush away some of that flashiness. Like, again, I'm at 30% opacity. I don't want to completely remove the flash because I like that snappiness. But I want some natural light to come through. And oh, it looks so much better, doesn't it? So much more detail. I'm going to brush in some shadows underneath so it doesn't look... That almost looks fake. Like, look, there's no depth right? It looks like this is floating above the floor because there's no shadow. So by brushing back in some of those shadows, we keep it believable. We're just cleaning up some of the reflections on that cabinet, and that looks great. All right, I'm happy with that. So the image still feels a bit flat because we did, by doing that luminosity masking, we took out a lot of the brights and a lot of the darks, which is essentially contrast. So I'm gonna grab curves layer, and I'm just gonna try here, let's see, medium contrast. Maybe I'll bring that above the luminosity masking layer, but below the flash. And that's going to be my contrast for the ambient layers. And I'm going to add another one above the flash. Because the flash is so contrasty, it doesn't need a lot. I just want one sort of general curves layer to tie the whole image together globally. And I'm just going to do linear contrast. I might have gone too far on that one there. So I'll just adjust it manually. I'm going to group these together, call it flash, and there's everything. What a huge difference. Looks awesome. I'll reduce, and I'm just doing this to taste, right? You can do it on your own. I'm going to take this remote control out because that's driving me nuts. I've got all my contrast where I want it. I've got my flash and ambient light where I want it. Grab the clone tool. And how did I do this? I can't believe it's like amateur hour leaving that remote right here. I'm just going to take this out slowly, piece by piece. Might not be perfect, but that's fine. And then something I want to do, it looks like there's a little bit of distortion. Like you can see this light, it's oval, it's not round. That's a little funky right there. I'm going to see if I want to crop this. I'm going to do some cleanup here. All right. I'm going to take out these wonky can lights in the countertop. This is kind of annoying right there, that little reflection. Take these guys out. And I'm gonna crop. So let's see where I probably will end up cropping before I go crazy with cloning. Something like that. Okay, so the one thing that's bugging me here is the distortion in this light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a selection. This is a very improvisational fix. I'm going to make a selection of this entire area of that distorted light. It's mostly the base of the pendant, right? And I'm going to copy that to a new layer. And that new layer, I'm just going to grab the warp tool. And I'm just going to gently, doesn't take a lot, gently warp that back into its natural oval shape. More of a hockey puck than a whatever it was. Something like that. And you can Command H to see the difference. Just well, sorry, Command H to hide the bounding box. And that looks pretty good. That's a little funky right there. That's okay. I'm going to hit Enter to commit those changes. And you can see the difference that makes, right, in that distortion. And the reason that I went so wide around it was because the shadow has to move too. And there's like a little bit of funkiness. See that line right here? This line. You can just add a mask. Take a big soft brush. And paint a soft transition into and out of that. See, oop, don't go too far, but sort of right around. And no one will know. So there's our distortion fix, and maybe I could just nudge the whole thing over. Like you can nudge the whole thing, right? Just use the arrow keys and line it up. And there's that. And then you can do the same thing, or I'm going to do the same thing, with the speaker right here. So copy it, paste it, transform it, warp it, bop it, twist it, pull it, undistort it. And that's how we get away with using a wide angle lens in a tight space. Better. So I'll rename this speaker. I'll rename this lamp base. This was cans in reflection. Honestly, I never name my layers like this when I'm working, but I don't want you guys to get, I don't want you to be afraid of how messy I am in real life. There's some sensor dust. So I'll group everything together. There's the before and after. I'm going to go ahead and save this into Lightroom. Okay, so we are back here in Lightroom. I think we added plenty of contrast in Photoshop. I'm just going to add a little texture and clarity to bring out some of that micro contrast. And I'm going to add a little vignette, because I think this is a nice shot for a vignette. And that is a finished photograph. So that one, again, to recap, ambient exposures, luminosity masking, flash, that one was a lot. So that was one of the more complicated shots to do, and these long straight spaces with a light at the end of the tunnel can get pretty tricky. But that is basically A to B on one of these sort of, like I said, almost bowling alley spaces, right? They can be very tricky to light, and they have some challenging conditions with the low ceilings, but we pulled it off. So let's go back on location and get our next lesson.